Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, reason, actualization of self-consciousness, virtue and the way of the world. In the first shape of active reason, self-consciousness took itself to be pure individuality, and it was confronted by an empty universality. In the second, the two sides of the antithesis, each had both moments within them, law and individuality. But one side, the heart, was their immediate unity, the other their antithesis. Here, in the relationship of virtue and the way of the world, the two members are each severally the unity and antithesis of these moments, or are each a movement of law and individuality towards one another, but a movement of opposition. For the virtuous consciousness, law is the essential moment, and individuality the one to be nullified, and therefore both in its own consciousness as well as in the way of the world. In the former case, one's own individuality is to be brought under the discipline of the universal, the intrinsically good, true and good. But under that discipline, it still remains a personal consciousness. True discipline requires nothing less than the sacrifice of the entire personality as proof that individual peculiarities are, in fact, no longer insisted on. In this individual sacrifice, the individuality in the way of the world is at the same time eradicated, for it too is a simple moment common to both. In the way of the world, individuality behaves in a way which is the reverse of its behaviour in the virtuous consciousness, namely it makes itself the essential moment, whereas what is intrinsically good and true it subordinates to itself. Further, the way of the world too is for virtue not merely this universal, which is perverted by individuality. On the contrary, the absolute order is likewise a common moment, only one that is not present for consciousness as an existent reality, but as the inner essence of the way of the world. That order, strictly speaking, has not first to be brought into existence by virtue, for to bring it into existence is qua action a consciousness of individuality, and individuality is really what has to be nullified, but this nullifying of individuality merely makes room, as it were, for the in itself of the way of the world to enter into existence on its own account. The general content of the actual way of the world we already know. Looked at more closely, it is again nothing else but the two preceding movements of self-consciousness. From them has issued the shape of virtue. Since they are its origin, they are antecedent to it. But virtue proceeds to nullify its origin and to realise itself, in other words, to become for itself. The way of the world is thus, on the one hand, the single individuality, which seeks its own pleasure and enjoyment. It is true that in doing so it destroys itself and thus satisfies the universal. But this very satisfaction, like the rest of the moments of this relationship, is a perverted form and movement of the universal. The reality is only that individuality of the pleasure and enjoyment, to which, however, the universal is opposed, a necessity which is merely the empty form of the universal, a merely negative reaction and an action devoid of content. The other moment of the way of the world is the individuality which claims to be law in its own right, and in its own conceit disturbs the existing order. The universal law, it is true, preserves itself in face of this conceit, and no longer makes its appearance as something opposed to consciousness and empty of content, as a blind necessity, but as a necessity within consciousness itself. But when it exists as the conscious relation of an absolutely contradictory reality, it is madness. As an objective reality, however, it is a perversion in general. The universal, then, does display itself in both aspects as the might which moves them, but the existence of this might is merely a universal perversion. It is from virtue now that the universal is to receive its true reality by nullifying individuality, the principle of the perversion. Virtue's purpose is, by so doing, to reverse again the perverted way of the world, and to make manifest its true essence. This true essence is at first only implicit in the way of the world, only it's in itself, it is not yet actual, and consequently virtue only believes it. This faith a virtue proceeds to raise to sight, without, however, enjoying the fruits of its labour and sacrifice. For insofar as it is an individuality, it is the activity of the conflict it wages with the way of the world, but its aim and true nature is to conquer the reality of the way of the world. The bringing into existence of the good thus affected is thus the cessation of its activity or the consciousness of individuality. What will be the outcome of this conflict itself? What virtue learns from it, whether by the sacrifice it makes of itself? The way of the world succumbs while virtue triumphs. This must be decided by the nature of the living weapons borne by the combatants. For the weapons are nothing else but the nature of the combatants themselves, a nature which only makes its appearance for both of them reciprocally. What their weapons are is already evident from what is implicitly present in this conflict. The universal is true for the virtuous consciousness in its faith, or is implicitly true. It is not yet an actual but an abstract universality. In this consciousness itself, it is present as a purpose, in the way of the world as an inner principle. It is precisely in this determination that the universal is present in virtue too, in relation to the way of the world, for virtue as yet only wills to accomplish the good, and does not to begin with claim that it is a reality. This characteristic can also be looked at in this way. The good, in making its appearance in the conflict with the way of the world, thereby presents itself as being for another, as something that does not have a being of its own, for otherwise it would not want to make itself true by conquering its opposite. That is, to begin with, only for another, means the same as was shown in the opposite way of looking at it, namely that it is, to begin with, an abstraction which has reality, not in its own right, but only in its relation to the way of the world. The good, or the universal then, as it comes to view there, is what are called gifts, capacities, powers. It is a mode of the spiritual in which it is represented as a universal, which requires the principle of individuality to give it life and movement. And this, in this principle, has an actual existence. This universal is put to good use by the principle of individuality, insofar as this principle lives in the virtuous consciousness, but is misused insofar as it clings to the way of the world, a passive instrument which, controlled by a free individuality, which is indifferent to the use it makes of it, can also be misused for the production of an actual existence which destroys it. A lifeless material lacking an independence of its own, which can be formed in this way or that, or even to its own ruin. Since the universal is equally at the disposal of the virtuous consciousness and the way of the world, it is not apparent whether virtue, thus armed, will conquer vice. The weapons are the same. They are these capacities and powers. Virtue has, it is true, held in reserve its belief in the original unity of its own purpose and the essential nature of the way of the world, a reserve that is intended to fall on the enemy from the rear during the fight, and in principle to achieve that aim. As a matter of fact, therefore, the knight of virtue's own part in the fighting is, strictly speaking, a sham fight, which he cannot take seriously because he knows that his true strength lies in the fact that the good exists absolutely in its own right. That is, brings itself to fulfillment, a sham fight which he also dare not allow to become serious, for what he turns against the enemy and finds turned against himself, and what he runs the risk of wasting and damaging, both in his own case as well as that of the enemy, is not to be the good itself, for he fights to preserve and accomplish that. What are risked in the fight are only the gifts and capacities which are not themselves at issue, but these are in fact nothing else but just that very universal in which individuality has been nullified, which is supposed to be preserved and realized by the conflict, but at the same time the universal is already realized directly by the very notion of the conflict. It is in itself the universal, and its realization means merely this, that it is at the same time for another. The two aspects specified above, in accordance with each of which it became an abstraction, are no longer separated. It is especially in and through the conflict that the good is established in both modes. The virtuous consciousness, however, enters into conflict with the way of the world, as if this were something opposed to the good. What the conflict offers to it is the universal, not merely as an abstract universal, but as a universal animated by individuality and existing for another. In other words, the actual good. Therefore, wherever virtue comes to grips with the way of the world, it always hits upon places which are the actual existence of the good itself, which, as the in itself of the way of the world, is inextricably interwoven in every manifestation of the way of the world, and in the actuality of that in itself, virtue has its own existence too. For virtue, therefore, the way of the world is invulnerable. All the moments which in virtue itself are supposed to be risked and sacrificed are just such existences of the good, and hence are inviolable relationships. Consequently, the conflict can only be an oscillation between preserving and sacrificing, or rather there can be neither a sacrifice of what is one's own, nor a violation of what is alien. Virtue is not merely like the combatant who in the conflict is only concerned with keeping his sword bright, but it has even started to fight in order to preserve the weapons, and not only can it not use its own weapons, it must also preserve intact those of the enemy and protect them against its own attack, for all are knowable parts of the good on behalf of which it went into battle. For this enemy, on the other hand, what is the essence is not the in itself, the implicit universal, but individuality, its power, therefore is the negative principle for which nothing is established or absolutely sacred, but which can risk and endure the loss of anything and everything. In doing so, it is just as certain of victory through its own resources as through the contradiction in which its opponent gets entangled. What virtue holds to be an intrinsic being, the way of the world, regards as merely an indifferent object. It is free from every principle that virtue holds to be established, and by which it is bound. Such a principle, the way of the world, has in its power, since it regards it as something it can either set aside or let be, as it can also the virtuous knight, who is fast bound by it. The latter cannot disentangle himself from it, as it were a cloak thrown around him from which he could free himself by leaving it behind. For to him it is something essential which he must not give up. Finally, as regards the ambush from which the intrinsically good is to attack the way of the world, cunningly from the rear, this is essentially a vain hope. The way of the world is the alert, self-assured consciousness that cannot be got at from behind, but faces in every direction, for its nature is that everything is merely an object for it, that everything stands in front of it. But when the intrinsically good is an indifferent object for the enemy, then it is involved in the conflict we have seen. But insofar as it is not such an object, but possesses intrinsic being, it is the passive instrument of gifts and capacities, a material lacking reality. If represented as a real being, it would be a dormant consciousness, one remaining in the background, no one knows where. Virtue, therefore, is conquered by the way of the world, because its purpose is, in fact, the abstract unreal essence, and because its action as regards reality rests on distinctions, which are purely nominal, if wanted to consist in bringing the good into actual existence by the sacrifice of individuality, but the side of reality is itself nothing else but the side of individuality. The good was supposed to be that which has an implicit being, and to be opposed to what is. But the in itself, taken in its real and true sense, is rather being itself. The in itself is, in the first instance, the abstraction of essence, in contrast to reality. But an abstraction is precisely what is not true, but exists only for consciousness, which remains, however, that it is itself what is called real, for the real is that which is essentially for another, or is being. But the consciousness of virtue rests on this distinction between the in itself and being, a distinction which has no truth. The way of the world was supposed to be the perversion of the good, because it has individuality for its principle, Only individuality is the principle of the real world, for it is precisely individuality that is consciousness, whereby what exists in itself exists equally for another. It does pervert the unchangeable, but it perverts it in fact from the nothing of abstraction into the being of reality. Thus, the way of the world triumphs over what, in opposition to it, constitutes virtue, triumphs over that which is the essenceless abstraction of essence. However, it does not triumph over something real, but over the creation of distinctions that are no distinctions. It glories in this pompous talk about doing what is best for humanity, about the oppression of humanity, about making sacrifices for the sake of the good, and the misuse of gifts. Ideal entities and purposes of this kind are empty, ineffectual words, which lift up the heart, but leave reason unsatisfied, which edify but raise no edifice. Declamations which specifically declare merely this, that the individual who professes to act for such noble ends and who deals in such fine phrases is in his own eyes an excellent creature, a puffing up which inflates him with a sense of importance in his own eyes and in the eyes of others, whereas he is in fact inflated with his own conceit. Virtue in the ancient world had its own definite, sure meaning, for it had in the spiritual substance of the nation a foundation full of meaning, and for its purpose an actual good already in existence. Consequently, too, it was not directed against the actual world as against something generally perverted, and against the way of the world, but the virtue we are considering has its being outside of the spiritual substance. It is an unreal virtue, a virtue in imagination, a name only which lacks the substantial content. The emptiness of this rhetoric, which denounces the way of the world, would be at once revealed if the meaning of its fine phrases had to be stated. These, therefore, are assumed to be something the meaning of which is familiar. The request to say what this really meaning is would be met either by a fresh flood of phrases or by an appeal to the heart, which inwardly says what they mean, which amounts to admitting that it is in fact unable to say what the meaning is. The fatuousness of this rhetoric seems to, in an unconscious way, to have come to be a certainty for the culture of our time, since all interest in the whole mass of such rhetoric and the way it is used to boost one's ego has vanished, a loss of interest which is expressed in the fact that it produces only a feeling of boredom. The result, then, which issues from this antithesis, consists in the fact that consciousness drops like a discarded cloak its idea of a good that exists only in principle, but has as yet no actual existence. In its conflict, it has learnt by experience that the way of the world is not as bad as it looked, for its reality is the reality of the universal. With this lesson in mind, the idea of bringing the good into existence by means of the sacrifice of individuality is abandoned, for individuality is precisely the actualization of what exists only in principle, and the perversion ceases to be regarded as a perversion of the good, for it is in fact really the conversion of the good as a mere end into an actual existence. The movement of individuality is the reality of the universal. However, with this result, that which, as the way of the world stood, opposed to the consciousness of what existed only in principle, has in fact likewise been conquered and has vanished. In that antithesis, individuality's being for self was opposed to essence or the universal and appeared as a reality separated from what exists, only in itself or in principle. But since reality has shown itself to be in undivided unity with the universal, then, just as the in itself of virtue is merely an aspect, so does the being for self of the way of the world also prove to be no more than that. The individuality of the way of the world may well imagine that it acts only for itself or in its own interest. It is better than it thinks, for its action is at the same time an implicitly universal action. When it acts in its own interest, it simply does not know what it is doing, and when it avers that when everyone acts in his own interest, it is merely asserting that no one knows what action is. When it acts for itself, it simply gives reality to what to begin with exists only for itself. The purpose of its being for self, which it imagines is opposed to that what virtue is in itself, its shallow cunning, as also its fine-spun explanations which know how to demonstrate the presence of self-interest in every action, all these have vanished, just as the purpose of virtue that exists only in itself, along with its rhetoric, have vanished. Thus, the activity of individuality, all that it does, is in its own self an end. The employment of its powers, the play of these powers in action, is what gives them life, otherwise they would be a lifeless in itself. But the in itself is not an unrealized abstract universal that lacks an existence, but rather is itself immediately the present, real existence of the process of individuality. An allegory of patience there. Which is very relevant to the whole phenomenology. If you can think back to the preface, he makes it clear that patience is a virtue of speculative philosophy.